The first thing I noticed was the rope-course hemp stretched taut between the saddle horn and the hands of a woman walking barefoot in the dust. Her ankles wobbled with each step, the rope jerking now and then when the bounty rider shifted his weight. Behind them, the sun was climbing spilling light across the hard-packed main street, catching on the bruise under her eye. They stopped in front of my office before I'd even stood from my chair. The marshal dismounted first, his polished boots hitting the porch boards with a sharp knock, and the smell of dry leather filled the space between us. The woman didn't look up. She didn't have to. I already knew nothing about this was right. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and tap like and subscribe if you've ever had to decide in a single moment whether to follow the rules or your own conscience. My name's Amos Creed, and for the past 7 years I've been wearing the badge in bitter wind, a strip of buildings laid thin along the desert edge. It wasn't where I planned to end up. I grew up farther east, where my father built fences with his own hands, and my mother kept to the Sabbath, even when the crops came in late. Neighbors helped each other brand calves or bring in hay before a storm, and nobody locked their doors unless they had to ride out for days. We didn't have much, but we respected what was ours and what belonged to others. The Army carried me west when I was still young enough to believe orders meant something. I rode as a scout through the Apache campaigns, learned the canyons and dry washes better than the faces of the men beside me. A bullet from a ridge patrol near the Chiricahua ended the running, left a shard of metal lodged in my thigh. After that, they kept me stateside, handing me posts in towns too small for the war, but too restless for peace. Bitter Wind was one of those a place where the dust settled in your clothes and the days blurred together unless trouble kicked them apart. Life here didn't leave room for extravagance. My cabin outside town was a one-room frame with a stove, a cot, and a workbench. I brewed coffee that always tasted scorched and fixed my own boots when the soles started peeling. The folks in town measured worth in land and cattle or in the dollars they could coax from the rail lines, inching closer each year. Out here, I measured it in how well a fence line held through a winter wind or whether the water barrel stayed clean. I kept to myself, doing the job as it came, breaking up fights on payday, hauling drunks off the boardwalk, chasing down the odd horse thief. That morning started no different, the sun just burning off the chill when the riders appeared on the South Road. One wore a government coat, the other kept his gear too clean for a working man. Between them walked the woman younger than I first thought, maybe mid-20s, hair in a loose braid, wrists bound in front. The marshal handed me a folded paper orders from Fort Bowie to hold her until an escort arrived from the east. The words on the page were cold and short, listing her the way you'd list a shipment of supplies. No trial, no jury, just to be transferred. I felt the weight of it even before I looked up again. The bounty rider smirked when I asked her name. "Won't talk," he said. But when I met her eyes, I saw they weren't empty, only watchful, measuring me as much as I was measuring her. The wind lifted dust along the street, and somewhere down by the saloon, a door slammed. I slid the paper into my shirt pocket, my jaw tight. I didn't know then what I'd do with her, only that the choice was already pressing against me like a storm building over the ridge. And as the marshal shifted his boots on my porch, I heard the creak of saddle leather and the restless stamp of a horse's hoof. The kind of sound that tells you nothing will be the same once the next step is taken. The marshal's voice carried over the porch rail dry as the grit blowing down Main Street. 3 days in your cell, Creed, until the escort comes through. He handed me the paper, the seal from Fort Bowie, stamped in fading ink. The bounty runner stayed a few steps back, one hand easy on the lead rope, as the woman stood still in the street. Her feet were red from the walk in the dust, clinging to the skin where the raw spots had split. She kept her eyes lowered, but I could see the shape of her jaw, the bruise coloring one cheek. I told them I'd take her in. The marshal nodded once, already looking past me toward the saloon. The rope came into my hand without a jerk, and I led her across the threshold of the office. The floorboards gave a slow groan under our weight, the smell of wood smoke lingering from the morning's fire. She stepped into the rear cell without a word. The click of the lock seemed too loud for the small space. She stood facing me, her gaze lifting only once, steady, but not defiant. I set the paper on my desk and poured a cup of water, sliding it through the bars along with a tin plate of beans. She didn't reach for either. I went back to my chair, the creak of it filling the silence, while I rubbed the heel of my palm into my temple. By nightfall, the two of them had taken rooms at the saloon. I lit the stove again, carried another plate to the cell, and set it on the floor inside the bars. This time she looked at the cup, but left it where it was. The lamplight flickered against the wall, catching in her hair. I turned the key, let it rest in the lock, and walked away. At dawn, I found her still there, cross-legged in the corner, hands on her knees. The door stood open, the air from outside drifting in. She'd had her chance to leave. Instead, she sat in the same place, watching me light the fire. I brought her another plate, and she took the water in both hands. No thanks, no questions. By midday, I had the mule hitched to the cart. She followed me out without a word, climbing into the seat beside me. The wheels groaned as we left the last boardwalk of bitter wind behind. The land opened flat and dry, broken by clumps of scrub and the dark line of the ridge. A few miles out, we reached my cabin, a small frame set between two leaning cottonwoods. Inside, the air was still. The single room held a narrow cot, a bench near the stove, a work table with its surface worn smooth. I pointed to the bench and left her there while I brought in firewood. She stayed seated, hands folded in her lap, eyes tracking the light from the door. When the chill deepened after sundown, I laid a wool blanket across her shoulders. She didn't look at me, but she didn't shrug it off. The next morning, she sat near the hearth, wrapped in the same blanket. Her eyes followed me as I moved about, not with suspicion, but with a quiet watchfulness. She ate the cornmeal mash I set in front of her, picking up the spoon slow, like she wasn't sure if it would be taken away. I noticed the way she shifted her weight onto the balls of her feet, avoiding the heels. There must have been thorns in them from the night she was caught. I told her there was salve in the tin by the wash basin. She went to it without speaking, and when I came back inside, she was sitting on the porch steps, dabbing her heel with a rag. The day passed in small chores. I cleared the tool shed, she swept the cabin floor. By dusk, the wind slid down off the ridge, rattling the siding. She boiled water while I patched a gap near the fireplace. She never asked why I'd brought her here instead of keeping her in the cell, and I didn't offer it. The truth was, there hadn't been much thought. I'd seen the look in her eyes, in that jail worn down, but not broken, and it stayed with me. That night, as I unwrapped the bandage from my thigh, she spoke for the first time since giving her name. "You were a soldier." I told her I'd been a scout. She nodded once and said nothing more. I lay awake a long while thinking on what would happen if the marshal came back sooner than planned. I'd already told folks in town she'd slipped away before sunrise. Most hadn't asked questions. Some hadn't believed it. Either way, if they came with orders, there'd be little room for more lies. On the third morning, a thin wind worked through the wall planks. She sat by the window, the blanket pulled around her, watching the land beyond the creek. "When will they come?" she asked. I told her it could be soon, maybe not tomorrow, but they'd come. She rubbed the place where the rope had been. "You lied to them." I said it was the easiest truth they'd believe. We ate in silence, then she washed the dishes without a word. Later, I fixed a section of the fence, feeling her eyes on me from the porch. I brought out a pair of women's boots I'd kept from a traveler who'd left them behind. She held them for a moment, then set them by the door. I rode into town that afternoon. Roy Hart leaned on the counter at the general store, telling me the marshal had left 2 mornings back looking none too pleased. Said the prisoner escaped, Roy added, squinting at me. I told him I hadn't seen it happen. He mentioned there'd been no tracks out of town. I met his eyes and said maybe he hadn't looked close enough. On the ride home, I took the long trail crossing a dry arroyo to keep from being followed. Smoke was curling from the chimney when I reached the cabin. The boots I'd given her were dusty now, worn from the day's use. She was sewing a tear in one of my shirts, her hand steady over the fabric. I told her the shed was still falling in. She said it was, but there was the hint of a smile when she answered. That night I spoke across the fire. I told her about my brother 16, an untrained, killed in a fight we shouldn't have started. She told me her mother wove baskets, and her brother had been 10 when he ran from the soldiers. Neither of them had carried a weapon. She asked if I thought she was a spy. I said no. I thought they needed someone to blame, and she was close enough. When she asked what would happen when they came back, I told her they wouldn't find her. She leaned back then, not in trust, but without the tension I'd seen before. That night, she slept on a cot in the far corner, the quilt pulled over her shoulders. Before she lay down, she added a log to the fire. I watched the flames catch, knowing we'd crossed some line between strangers and something else, though I couldn't yet name it. By the 5th week, the days had taken on a steady rhythm. I rode into bitter wind, only when it was needed, taking the long trail back each time, watching for dust that didn't belong to my own horse. Folks in town still asked careful questions, not about her by name, but about anything unusual out past the creek. I kept my answers short, paying for my goods in coin and moving on before the talk could stretch too long. At the cabin, Ta had begun working on things without waiting for me to mention them. One morning I found the garden bed near the porch, cleared of weeds, the soil turned, and a neat row of beans planted from a sack that had sat untouched for 2 years. She had scrubbed the inside walls until the wood grains showed lighter under the soot, washed every cup and pan, and straightened the stack of books on the shelf I hadn't touched since the winter before last. My shirts were mended where seams had given folded in the small chest at the foot of the cot. We didn't speak much about those changes. If she left her bowl half full at supper, I would slide my portion toward her. She didn't push it back. When the air turned colder, I saw her take the last of the quilts from the cedar chest, setting one by my chair, before bringing another to her cot. The bruises on her skin had faded to yellow. The cut on her heel had closed, and she no longer favored one foot over the other. One evening after the fire had burned low, she asked, "You said you stopped listening to orders." When was that? I sat forward, elbows on my knees, and told her about a raid near the river fork years back. We'd been told there were weapons stockpiled. What we found were 3 women and 2 children. One of the men fired before they even stood up. I buried one of the boys myself. He couldn't have been more than 9. She held my gaze, saying nothing, and moved a little closer to the hearth. The next day, clouds gathered low to the south, heavy with the kind of rain that comes early some years. I hauled a ladder to the side of the cabin, meaning to patch the roof before the wind carried off another shingle. My leg burned as I climbed each step, a reminder of what the old wound left behind. She came out and stood at the base of the ladder. "You shouldn't be up there alone," she said. I told her I wasn't dead yet. She said my leg was shaking. I looked down and saw she was right. I climbed down, handed her the hammer and nails. She worked her way up, halfway steady and sure, and together we finished the job before the light failed. That night, she cooked for the first time. It was simple rice with dried onion beans and salt, but the warmth filled the room. I washed the bowls after, and she swept the floor. We moved past each other without the startle that used to be there. Before she went to her cot, I handed her a mug of warm water. She nodded once, and our eyes held longer than they had before. Just before I turned down the lamp, she said my name. "If they come again," she said, "and I'm not here, don't look for me." My jaw tightened. I asked why she would leave. She didn't answer, only looked at her hands. I told her she wasn't a burden and she wasn't in the way. She didn't speak again, but that night her cot was closer to the stove. By dawn, the wind had dropped away, leaving a stillness over the land. She was still asleep when I rose, the quilt pulled up to her shoulders. In the softer light, she looked younger than she had the day I saw her walking into town with a rope at her wrists. I added a log to the fire and kept quiet until she stirred. Over breakfast, she told me sometimes she talked in her sleep loud enough to wake others. Her mother used to wake her before it scared anyone. She didn't say why. Later, I brought out an old cedar chest from the back closet. Inside were things from before my scouting days, a wool coat, a worn map of the New Mexico trails, and a bundle of women's clothes. They'd belonged to my sister, who'd died back east during a fever outbreak. I hadn't seen her for years before the letter came. I told Ta the clothes might fit her better than the ones she had. She ran her hand over the faded blue dress before carrying it to her cot. When she stepped out wearing it, the shoulders hung loose, but it was the right length. She didn't speak, and neither did I. By afternoon, the clouds thickened and the wind shifted. She helped me gather the wash from the line before the first cold gusts swept across the porch. That evening over supper, she finally asked, "Why didn't you just let me go?" I told her she'd already lost enough and that I'd seen her as someone the orders didn't bother to know. She said I could have been killed for hiding her. I told her not doing anything would have been worse. Her hands tightened around her cup. "No one's ever done that for me," she said. That night, she didn't sleep on the cot. She sat beside me on the bed, quiet, her hands folded in her lap. She told me she'd never had a home, not really always moving season after season. Once when she was 12, she asked her mother if they could stay in one place. Her mother said the world wouldn't let them. She looked at me and asked if I wanted her to stay. I told her yes. The rain came just before dawn, sweeping across the desert in long, slanted sheets. When I woke, she was beside me, breathing steady, one arm across her waist. We moved through the morning as we had on any other day, boiling water sealing the windows, but the cabin felt closer, the sound of the rain pressing against the walls. By afternoon, the clouds thinned, leaving damp ground and a low fog along the ridge. She sat near the fire, sewing a curtain for the east window, where the light came in too hard. I was checking supplies when she asked, "You ever thought about adding another room?" I said the place was built for one. She said maybe it wasn't anymore. The thought stayed with me while I stepped out to check the roof line and the wood pile. That was when I saw the track's hoof prints in the mud at the lower trail, smaller than my mare's, fresh within the hour. I went back inside and told her someone had been through. She froze, asked if I was sure. I said they hadn't stopped at the house, but they'd been close enough to see it. Could be a scout, maybe someone working for the marshal. I checked the ammunition and loaded a second revolver, setting it on the table. She asked if I was planning to fight. I told her I wasn't planning to hand her over. That night, the tension came back, though, not the kind from our first days. This was the kind that settled in when you knew what you had could be taken. I kept the lamp low, the fire quiet, and my shotgun near the door. Near midnight, the sound of saddle leather and a horse shifting in damp dirt reached us. I stepped to the porch, revolver low in my hand. A man sat his horse at the clearing's edge, a long coat hanging to his stirrups, a wide-brimmed hat shadowing his face. He didn't speak, only turned his horse and rode back into the trees. I stayed out a long time, scanning the dark. When I came back in, she was sitting upright on the cot. I told her they'd be back. She nodded once. We didn't sleep after that, only kept close, waiting for morning. The morning after that rider's visit, I was out near the tree line with my rifle slung across my shoulder. The air was heavy from the rain, holding the scent of wet mesquite and pine. No fresh tracks showed along the trail, but I didn't take that as an end to it. Inside, Ta was folding cloth into the cedar chest, her movements careful and steady, the way folks work when they know trouble might be close. She asked how soon they'd come. I told her maybe a couple of men, maybe the marshal himself, and no one in town would stand in their way. She poured coffee into 2 tin mugs, setting one in front of me without looking up. I went to the shed and brought back a small wooden box, setting it on the table between us. Inside were old papers, faded photographs, brass buttons from my scout days, and a letter worn soft at the edges. I told her I'd never spoken much on who I'd been, but maybe it mattered now. My father had been a preacher back east, a man who taught me to handle a rifle and read the good book in the same summer. I'd signed on young thinking I'd be part of making peace and ended up riding into canyons under orders I didn't believe in. She listened without breaking her gaze, then told me I hadn't caused what happened to her. I said maybe not, but I'd been part of what made it possible. She laid a hand over mine and said stopping had to count for something. We spent the day preparing without talking much. I checked the rifle and cleaned the revolver she'd seen me set aside. She stitched a tear in the saddlebag, boiled enough water to fill every jug in the cabin. We didn't say the word run, but it was there between us. When dusk came, I pulled 2 chairs to the porch. The clouds were breaking apart overhead, the air turning cooler. We sat side by side, each holding a mug of hot water, watching the trail where the rider had stood the night before. After a long while, she spoke. If we get through this, what then? I asked her what she wanted. She said to stay, but not hidden, not as someone to be kept from sight. I reached into my coat pocket and brought out a small leather pouch. Inside was a plain silver ring that had belonged to my sister. I told her I had no speeches and no land beyond this place. But if she wanted to stay, she could stay as mine. She studied the ring for a moment before sliding it onto her finger. We didn't kiss, but when we went inside later, we shared the same bed again, not from fear, but from choice. At first light, I was already on the porch with my rifle across my knees. The boards were damp under my boots, and a faint mist was rising off the ground. Ta stood inside the doorway, her braid pulled tight, the silver ring bright against her hand on the frame. 3 riders crested the ridge, 2 soldiers in uniform, and Marshal Dugan between them. They slowed as they reached the clearing. The marshal dismounted his boots, dark from the wet grass. He said I'd lied, that I'd told folks she'd escaped while keeping her here. I told him she wasn't a prisoner. He held up the order from Fort Bowie, saying it didn't matter what I called her. She was to be sent east. I stepped off the porch and told him I'd read those orders, that they were written for someone no one had bothered to question. She was a survivor, and that was different. Ta stepped out beside me, then her voice steady when she told him she wouldn't go. He said she didn't get to choose. I told him she did. He asked if I was willing to throw my life away for this. I told him I'd thrown away enough already. The soldiers shifted in their saddles, but didn't move forward. The marshal studied me for a long moment, then stepped back and swung into his saddle. Without another word, he turned his horse toward the ridge, the soldiers following. I waited until they were out of sight before I lowered the rifle. Ta was still standing there, her shoulders set. I told her it was done, that they wouldn't come again. She reached up and touched my face, then kissed me full, without hesitation. In the days that followed, the cabin settled back into its quiet. We finished the curtain she'd started and planted more in the garden. I began cutting beams for the second room we'd talked about. She called the place home now. One morning, she reached into her dress pocket and handed me a woven charm, the kind her mother used to make from basket scraps. She said it was for protection. I hung it by the door. Spring came slow, and with it the comfort of knowing we weren't carrying the weight alone anymore. The days that followed settled into a quiet rhythm, though there was no forgetting the ridge where the marshal had last appeared. The garden rows were coming in strong, and we kept the soil turned and watered from the creek. Inside the second room began to take shape in our minds more than in wood beams stacked along the wall boards, cut and waiting the smell of fresh sawdust hanging in the air. The woven charm Ta had given me swayed slightly. Each time the door opened, a reminder of her mother's hands and the promise of protection it carried. One morning the air was still cool when I saddled the mare for a trip into town. Ta stayed behind, saying she'd mend the shirts left on the peg and finish the curtain for the window. The trail was dry, but every turn I took was the long way, skirting the open stretches so no one could follow unseen. At the general store, Roy Hart greeted me with his usual lean over-the-counter, eyes sharp. He asked if the marshal had been back. I told him I hadn't seen him since that morning at the cabin. Roy said word was drifting in from Fort Bowie about new orders moving east. I paid for coffee salt and nails and left before the talk could grow roots. The ride back was slow, the sun warm enough to lift the scent of sage from the hillsides. When I reached the cabin, Ta was on the porch with the wash line strung tight shirts flapping in the breeze. The curtain hung in the east window now, a simple pattern stitched clean. She looked up when I unsaddled, her eyes following me without a word. That evening we sat by the fire, the kettle between us. She asked if I thought they'd try again. I said they might, but not the same way. If they came, it would be quieter, less show. She nodded and set another log on the fire, the flame catching with a dry crack. 2 days later, I was splitting kindling near the shed when a glint of light caught my eye from the far side of the creek. Someone was there too far to make out a face, but close enough to be watching. By the time I reached the porch, the figure was gone, brush moving only with the wind. Ta stepped out asking what I'd seen. I told her, and we both knew it wasn't chance. We checked the rifles that night, made sure the lanterns were trimmed, and left the boots by the door for quick use. The next morning, she joined me in repairing the corral fence. We worked without much talk, passing nails and boards, the thud of the hammer carrying in the still air. When we stopped for water, she asked what I would do if I wasn't here, if the cabin and the land weren't mine. I told her I'd still have made the same choice. She didn't answer, just looked toward the ridge, her fingers tightening on the tin cup. Later that week, the first stretch of the new room was framed. She held the boards steady while I drove the nails, her stance balanced and sure. We talked about where the stove might sit in winter, how the extra space could be for storing grain or maybe a bed. Her voice held more ease now, as if speaking about the future didn't feel like tempting fate. That night, a faint sound woke me, the slow, deliberate creak of a board outside the porch. I reached for the rifle and moved to the window. In the half-light of the moon, 2 horses stood at the clearing's edge, riders, still in the saddle. They didn't come forward, only watched for a long minute before turning back toward the trail. I stayed at the window until they were gone. Ta was sitting up when I turned. We didn't speak, but both of us knew we'd see them again. The following day, she went through the cedar chest once more, folding clothes tighter, setting aside what could be packed quickly. I cut more firewood than we needed, stacking it high against the wall. The hours moved slow, each task done with the care of someone who doesn't know how much time is left. That evening, as we sat on the porch, the sun dropped behind the ridge, laying long shadows across the clearing. The air was cool, carrying the smell of damp earth from the creek. Somewhere out there, a rider's silhouette passed against the fading light, too far to tell if he'd seen us. I felt Ta's hand rest lightly on my arm. We stayed like that until the dark closed in, knowing the quiet between now and the next knock on the door would not last forever. By mid-morning the next day, I was in the shed planing down the last of the beams we'd cut for the new room. The air smelled of fresh wood and pine resin, each stroke of the blade smooth against the grain. Ta was outside hanging another wash line to catch the better light. Her voice reached me through the open door. "There's someone on the ridge," she said. I stepped out and followed her gaze. A single rider sat on a bay horse too far for me to make out his face, but not far enough to mistake what he was doing. He was watching. By the time I'd crossed the yard toward the rifle propped near the porch, he was already turning back the horse, moving in a slow, deliberate walk along the ridge, before disappearing into the pines. Ta stood with her hands wrapped around the line knuckles pale. "Same man?" she asked. I told her it could be. It didn't matter, someone had marked the place again. That afternoon I saddled the mare and rode the long way into town, keeping off the main road until I reached Bitter Wind's back edge. Roy Hart was behind the counter, sorting nails into glass jars. He asked if we'd had any more company. I said nothing worth writing down. His eyes narrowed just enough to show he didn't buy it. I paid for lamp oil flour and a tin of coffee, then stepped outside into the late light. 2 horses were tied outside the saloon, their tack clean, their riders nowhere in sight. I mounted up and left without looking back. When I reached the cabin, the sun was dropping behind the ridge, turning the sky a rust red. Ta had supper waiting the table set with the curtain she'd finished folded neatly at one end. We ate without talk, the fire snapping in the stove. After the bowls were cleared, she sat across from me. "If they come again, it won't be like last time," she said. I nodded. No speeches, no daylight. I agreed. Her eyes stayed on mine for a moment longer before she rose to bank the fire. That night, the wind picked up across the clearing, working through the boards in the new frame. I checked the rifles, leaving one within her reach on the porch. The lantern burned low shadows stretching across the walls. Somewhere past midnight, I heard it, the slow shift of hooves in damp earth, the faint creak of leather. I stepped out, the cold hitting hard. 2 men sat on their horses just beyond the fence, both with hats pulled low. Neither spoke. I stayed on the porch, the rifle low but ready. After a long minute, they turned their horses and moved off the way they'd come. The sound of them faded into the trees. When I went back in, Ta was sitting on the edge of the bed, boots on her braid over one shoulder. She didn't ask what they wanted. We both knew it was a measure of how far they could push before the next step. The morning brought a thin frost across the ground. We worked in the yard, stacking the last of the firewood, checking the corral gate. Each task was done in silence, the kind born from understanding. There wasn't much to say. By midday, I walked the perimeter of the clearing looking for sign. Fresh hoofprints cut across the soft ground near the south trail heading toward the creek. Whoever it was hadn't bothered to hide them. That evening, I brought the remaining supplies in from the shed, the jugs of water, the sack of grain, and the extra blankets. Ta set them by the bed without a word. As the light faded, she moved her cot nearer the stove. "We should keep both rifles loaded," she said. I told her they already were. The sky darkened quick, the cold settling in sharp. We sat by the fire, the woven charm by the door, stirring slightly with the draft. Outside, the ridge lay quiet, but I knew it wouldn't stay that way. The sound of the wind in the pines was steady, the kind that could cover a man's approach. I kept my boots on when we turned down the lamp. Somewhere in the hours before dawn, a knock came, not loud, but deliberate, 3 times against the wood. I was at the door before the third hit. When I pulled it open, no one stood there. Just the dark clearing, the frost glinting under the moon, and the empty stretch of trail beyond. I stepped out onto the porch, listening. From the far edge of the trees came the faint sound of hooves retreating. Inside, Ta was standing with the rifle in her hands. Her eyes didn't leave mine. "They're waiting for something," she said. I closed the door, slid the bolt, and checked the fire. The room was warm, but the air between us carried the weight of what was coming. Before first light, I saddled the mare and rode toward town. The cold held in the low ground, a thin mist lifting off the creek. I kept to the back trails, avoiding the main road until I reached the livery. The bay horse from the ridge was there, tied beside two others. Its tack was the same polished leather with a silver concho on the breast collar. Inside the livery, Tom Rayner was pitching hay into a stall. He glanced at me, then at the horse outside. "That one came in late last night," he said. "Rider didn't give a name. Paid cash." I asked if he knew where the man stayed. Tom shook his head, but mentioned he'd seen him talking to a tall fellow in a dark coat near the freight office. I crossed the street slow, the boards under my boots slick with frost. The freight office was closed, but fresh boot tracks led around back. They stopped near a stack of empty crates, then doubled back toward the alley. Whoever I was chasing knew enough to cover his trail. By the time I reached the mercantile, the sun was over the ridge. Ta was inside with Mrs. Hart, sorting through bolts of calico. She glanced up, but didn't break her talk. I bought a pound of coffee and a box of cartridges, then stepped outside. Across the way, two men stood in the shade of the saloon awning. One wore a dark coat, tall and lean hat brim low. The other, I didn't know. They watched until I swung into the saddle, then turned back inside. The ride home was quiet except for the wind through the pines. Ta was already there when I arrived. The curtain she'd been making now hung in the window. "We have company in town," I told her. She set down the basket she was holding. "I know," she said. "Mrs. Hart told me they've been asking about us." We kept the rifles close that night. The moon was thin, the clearing washed in silver. Sometime past midnight, the sound of hoofbeats came from the south trail, slow measured, never crossing into the yard. I stepped onto the porch. Shadows moved between the trees just far enough back to keep their shapes hidden. After a few minutes, they turned and melted into the dark. The next morning, I found a strip of cloth caught on the fence near the corral, a piece of dark wool, the kind a coat collar might lose. I pocketed it and went back inside. Ta was at the table lacing up her boots. "If they're testing the ground, they'll be back," she said. I nodded. "And next time, they'll step closer." By late afternoon, the wind had shifted, carrying the smell of wood smoke from the east. I checked the rifles again, laid them where we could reach them. As the light faded, a rider appeared at the far edge of the clearing. He didn't approach, just sat his horse hat low, watching. The cold kept him from staying long, but it was enough to know the wait was nearly over. When the sun dropped, the air turned sharp. We ate in silence, each sound from outside pulling our eyes to the door. Near midnight, a single knock sounded steady, deliberate. I opened it to find no one there. The trail beyond the porch was empty, but the sense of being watched pressed in like the cold. Ta was standing by the table when I came back in, rifle in hand. "It's close now," she said. I banked the fire, the glow casting long shadows on the walls. Somewhere in the trees, a horse shifted leather, creaking in the stillness. The next move would be theirs, and it would come soon. The next move came before dawn. Hoofbeats thundered from the south trail, cutting through the stillness. I was already on the porch with the rifle when two riders broke into the clearing. Ta stepped out beside me, her coat pulled tight. They didn't get the chance to call out. From the trees on the east side, Sheriff Doolin and 3 deputies rode in, hard rifles drawn. The men froze where they sat. One wore the dark coat I'd seen in town, the collar frayed where I'd found that strip of cloth. "Drop your guns," the sheriff said, voice even but carrying. Metal clattered onto frozen ground. The deputies moved in, tying the men's hands and pulling them from their saddles. Turns out they were wanted in 2 counties for land fraud and theft, using false deeds to drive families off homesteads. The sheriff handed me a folded paper, the ink still crisp. It was my land deed, the one I thought long gone signed and sealed under my name. "Found this in their saddlebags," he said. "Looks like you've got it back." Ta exhaled slow, a sound that seemed to lift months of strain from her shoulders. We watched as the riders were led away, their boots sinking deep into the frost. The clearing felt different once they were gone, quieter, as if the land itself could breathe again. That evening, we sat at the table with the lamp burning low. I ran my thumb over the deed, feeling the pressed edge of the seal. Outside, the wind had softened, carrying the smell of pine instead of smoke. We didn't speak much. We didn't have to. Justice had come not loud or quick, but steady and sure, like the turning of a season. The house, the land, the quiet between us. It was all ours again. Life on the frontier doesn't hand out guarantees. But if you stand your ground and keep your word, sometimes the dust settles in your favor. And when it does, you hold on to it with both hands. If you've ever had to fight for your place in the world, I hope you found your own kind of peace. And if this story stayed with you, I'd be glad for you to share it so it might settle somewhere it's needed.